Did you hear Drake's post-game
No, I did. No, okay.
Oh,
I watched the post game a little bit, but I did not catch anything about Drake. Now
oh,
you need to tell me.
Carlos,
Tell me the
Carlos.
words.
So he starts going on about how poetic it is, the
Oh
sixth
Lord,
and six,
was it God's plan?
right? And no, he
Was it
didn't get
God's
to
plan?
that. But then he started talking about he's like, I like my chips. He's like, but I want my chips with dip. And people are like,
This is why this man is. I don't care. I refuse to acknowledge his quote unquote music career. He is the Degrassi kid. I refuse to acknowledge anything further.
and it's like what? I was like, just stop talking. Like, just stop talking. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not about you.
You are now listening to episode 20. Yes, I said 20 of the Unnecessary Nonsense podcast. The podcast of two unqualified idiots rambling on sports topics they likely know nothing about for an indeterminate timeline. Brought to us this week by Historical Moments, which will come into play in a couple of minutes here. So I'm Carlos Alcazar, and not with me at the moment, but will be joining me shortly through the power of editing, will be my co-host, Dave Turnbull. So we are going to, not surprisingly, I'm recording this on a Friday, where I'm about 24 hours removed from the start of Game 6 of the NBA Finals, which resulted in the first championship outside of the United States. The first non-U.S. NBA champion, the Toronto Raptors, defeated the Golden State Warriors by the score of 114-110. And don't let the score fool you, the last couple of moments were a little bit dramatic, but we'll talk about that a little bit more once we get into the conversation about it. However, I would be remiss if I ignored the other championship that was decided this week, where the St. Louis Blues won their first Stanley Cup in franchise history over the Boston Bruins, off of a 32-save performance from Jordan Binnington. An incredible performance, really, because if you had a chance to see the game, you really saw a Boston team that was determined to try to win Game 7 and a Jordan Binnington who was determined not to allow it. Boston horrifically outshot St. Louis, especially in the first two periods where they were able to effectively outshoot them by a margin of 12-4 in the first period and 11-6 in the second period. Through two periods, they were already at 23 shots for Boston to only 10 to St. Louis. They barely reached double digits in shots, and St. Louis was winning the game. That's really what it came down to, is that Boston was able to get shots off, but St. Louis was efficient in the sense that they were able to take the few shots they got and were able to get on the scoreboard. The third period was even, 10 shots apiece, bringing the total differential 33 shots for Boston to 20 for St. Louis. So that was flattering. The third period is really what kind of helped it. It evened it out a little bit. But otherwise, if you just take it from the perspective of opportunities, Boston seemed to be dominating that game, but Jordan Binnington was the difference. So I want to talk about the Stanley Cup a little bit first. And then I'm going to also talk about my experience watching UFC 238 last weekend, which was an excellent card. So I'll talk about those two things. And then I'll kind of splice in a conversation that Dave and I had talking about the Toronto Raptors. So Dave, as his Raptor fandom has grown throughout this playoff run, will have some opinions on his feelings about how the series itself turned out and a lot of the little things that came of it. Another interesting element that comes from the NBA Finals, and we'll talk about more of that in a little bit, is all the subplots that come from it. So obviously the Raptors winning their first NBA championship is a big notable thing in and of itself. Great for the franchise, great for the fan base, and expanding basketball into the international markets. Obviously they've got a team here, but it's a completely different story when you've got a championship. It just takes it to another level. Obviously now that kind of takes us into the NBA offseason, but the game itself also had some other outcomes as far as injury and the implications that that has going into the next NBA season. So, a couple of things to talk about for sure. As always, one other thing I'll make note of. If you've never heard the podcast before, thank you for listening. And you can check us out on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. We also have a YouTube channel that you can find by Unnecessary Nonsense Podcast. Just type that in and you'll find usually archived versions of our podcasts, as well as sometimes when a big event happens, I will record a video or at least an audio version, and it'll be published on the YouTube channel. So you can always check that out with a static image of our faces in cartoon form, so you can enjoy that. Now, let me add a few more points about the Stanley Cup Final. So kind of an important, kind of side story to this. I mentioned on previous podcasts that I had trouble really getting that enthusiastic about this matchup, just because although the St. Louis story was interesting and, kind of rooting against Boston a little bit, also kind of added an element to it, the matchup itself really wasn't that intriguing for me. Regardless of who won, it wasn't going to be that much of an exciting moment. With that said, for the St. Louis fans, I can say confidently that they've earned it as much as any other fan base. The St. Louis Blues were the last of the post-original 6 teams to never have won a Stanley Cup. A little bit of history here is probably a little bit helpful.
The St. Louis Blues joined the NHL as part of the very first expansion class, as I said. That happened in 1967 expansion, along with the Minnesota North Stars, who then became the Dallas Stars, winning the Stanley Cup as the Dallas Stars. The Los Angeles Kings, who have won the Stanley Cup in recent years. The Philadelphia Flyers, who won a couple of cups in the 70s. The Pittsburgh Penguins, who won 3 cups in the last decade or so. So they've been a pretty good team, and a couple of cups in the 90s with Mario Lemieux. And the California Golden Seals, who are kind of a funny story in and of their own, because although the Seals never won a championship either, they did become the Cleveland Barons, who also never won anything, but they did end up merging with the Minnesota North Stars. So again, we're back to the Dallas Stars and that Stanley Cup. So in reality, St. Louis was the only of these first expansion franchises who went up until this point without having won a Stanley Cup in some iteration or some variation.
The significance of this championship comes about from the fact that in the early years after the original 6 era ended and you added 6 more teams to the league, they had set it up in a way where the expansion teams could basically kind of play against each other. The end result is by having a division there for those teams, it meant that one of them would get to the Stanley Cup final every year. And for the first 3 years of that format, it was the St. Louis Blues. So they would get to the Stanley Cup finals. And part of that came from, as I said, an aging core of veterans. So they had a goaltending tandem. So in the first season, they had Glenn Hall. And then in the second and the third attempts, they had kind of a goaltending tandem of Glenn Hall as well as the last, waning moments of Jacques Plante's career. And what's interesting about that is that they were still both fairly good goaltenders, and they were platooning, especially in the last couple of years. But you have to think, in the third of those 3 cup runs, Jacques Plante was 41 and Glenn Hall was 38. So it was really very much the end of their careers. They were a part of the team, and they were great contributors to it, but it was an aging squad as far as the goaltending was concerned and some of the other players that played there. But they were good enough to get to the Cup Finals, and they were being coached by Scotty Bowman. Obviously, Scotty Bowman would go on to have some great success in the rest of the 70s with the Montreal Canadiens, who were the team that also coincidentally happened to victimize the St. Louis Blues in a couple of those attempts. And up until, after those first couple of years, going into this year's playoff season, the most success the St. Louis Blues had ever had, really, with a whole ton of crushing playoff defeats. The most memorable moment in their playoff history was the famous image of Bobby Orr, kind of being tripped and then falling, Superman style in front of the net as the Boston Bruins scored to win the Stanley Cup, I believe it was in 1970. Not an illustrious history, even though the St. Louis Blues made the playoffs 42 times. So if you think about their track record going from 1968 onward, 42 playoff appearances is incredibly impressive. But at the same time, up until this year, up until this playoff run, they had not been to the Cup final again since those first 3 years of their expansion existence, and they had never won a single Stanley Cup final game. And that's the historical significance of it. Something really kind of crazy if you think about it from the St. Louis fan standpoint. And that doesn't even take into account my personal favorite story about the St. Louis Blues and what could have been. In the early 1980s, I think around 82 or 83, the St. Louis Blues were almost sold to a group that was intending to build an arena in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, of all places. And the deal was done in the sense that they had agreed to sell it to them. But the Board of Governors rejected the deal, 15-3 at the time, citing that they felt Saskatoon was not big enough or financially stable enough to support an NHL team. So if it wasn't for the Board of Governors intervening, it's very possible that in the early 1980s, the St. Louis Blues could have become the Saskatoon Blues, or whatever else they would have called it, which would have been kind of crazy if you really think about it in context. I don't know if such a team in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada would have survived, especially in the early 90s when the Canadian dollar put a big hindrance on a lot of Canadian franchises. And you can ask the former Winnipeg Jets and former Quebec Nordique fans about the impact that had. But it is interesting to think that in the early 1980s, it was a real possibility there could have been another Canadian team in the NHL at that time, and it came very close, were not for a Board of Governors vote. With all that baggage from the franchise, it is an incredible accomplishment for them to have succeeded and been able to have this improbable playoff run. As far as the Stanley Cup final is concerned, that's really all I have to say about it. Congratulations to the St. Louis Blues. Congratulations to their fans. And congratulations to one other person that I will kind of mention as another little side story that I thought was kind of interesting. If I can, I'll try to add a link to the show notes that hopefully will cite an article. If I can find an article, I'm sure I can. But there's a gentleman named Scott A. Barry who became kind of famous as a result of the Stanley Cup final, who ended up in his recounting of the story, he ended up in Las Vegas on business. And I don't remember at what point during the season, but this was when the St. Louis Blues were, maybe when they were in last place or when they were having some struggles. He came across a sports book that was willing to take a wager on the St. Louis Blues to win the Stanley Cup at 250 to 1 odds, which is obviously astronomical. So you don't really have to put much of a wager to potentially have a huge payout. So he decided to take a bet of $400, which they accepted at 250 to 1 odds. And obviously, now that we know the outcome, it turns out that his ticket, and I'll give him credit for this, because the temptation to hedge such a bet, because there are avenues where you can sell a ticket like that prior to the outcome happening and kind of hedge your bets. That was a $100,000 ticket. Now, I don't remember the exact number, but I believe he turned down an offer of $30,000 or $40,000, which, is clearly a lot of money for a lot of folks. But I guess he really decided to stick with his guns on that one. And, his conviction ended up paying off. Congratulations to Scott A. Barry on a winning ticket of a proportion that we can only dream about. Imagine hitting a 250 to 1 shot in anything. Very impressive. So there are a lot of little side stories with the St. Louis Blues, victory, aside from the team on the ice, certainly. As far as the series is concerned, going to 7 games is kind of a classic Stanley Cup final, certainly. I didn't watch enough to really get a sense of the flow of the series. I will say Game 7 definitely had the drama to it, given, like I said, the way that Boston outshot St. Louis. But nonetheless, another Boston team came very, very close, within 1 game of winning another championship. So at least the St. Louis Blues spared us that for at least a couple of months before the next Boston team takes a stab at it. With all that said, I think I'd like to say a few words about UFC 238. An excellent card. I ended up ordering it at home and watching. I will say that if you have the opportunity, I'm not going to go recapping through all the fights, but all I'm going to say to you is that it was an excellent card. It's definitely worth a rewatch if you're able to go and find some of the fights on there. But even if you can't do that, my suggestion to you, when you see a card like this, the UFC is very good at building these cards from time to time, where there is plenty of, even if you don't worry about star power, styles do make fights, and the opportunity for really interesting fights was there. Whenever you're considering it, look at the undercard. Don't just look at the headliners. Look at the undercard and look at the possibilities. And if you don't want to shell out the money, sometimes the earlier prelims sometimes can have some of the fights of the night. So as I said, I'm not going to go through the whole card, but if you get a chance, go and check out some highlights from the Tony Ferguson fight, and go and check out the knockout from Valentina Shevchenko on Jessica Ai. It is one of the craziest head kicks you're going to see. Now if you're a little bit squeamish, you're going to see someone go down like a tree falling in the forest. So if that's not the kind of thing that you're okay with, then forget it what I said. But otherwise, if you're a fight fan, you're not going to see a much more devastating one-shot knockout than that head kick. So you can definitely check that one out. But UFC 238, worth every penny in my opinion, a good card. And if you have UFC Fight Pass, probably within the next month or two, you'll be able to recap the whole card if you didn't order the pay-per-view in the first place. But you should have. It was a good one. Now, one other thing I didn't mention in the early preamble, but I will make a quick note of it here, is that even though we didn't get a chance to really talk about it much today, the CFL season did kick off. So the Hamilton Ticats did win the first game of the season. We'll probably try to include right in the agenda next week to start talking a little bit about the CFL because, it gives us a little football content during the summer months. Jays are still not really super impressive. They're playing okay, but they're playing like a team of a lot of young players. So they're going to have their moments. They're going to have their ups and their downs. But the CFL season does give us a little bit extra to talk about. And there's our, Canadian content. So now without further ado, I think let's talk about that NBA Finals. So I'm going to throw it to myself from the future, talking to my co-host Dave about the NBA Finals, kind of his thoughts, my thoughts, And some of the storylines that we're going to be able to really break down and parse out over the next couple of months that I think are going to keep the NBA relevant. I think the NBA is not done pulling headlines because now they're pretty much a year-round thing. So, the conversation I'm having with Dave about the NBA Finals and the first championship for the Toronto Raptors.
So, I'll make the editor's note here in the conversation itself. Unfortunately, Dave professed his love for Kawhi, agreed to name his children after Kawhi. A lot of really, emotional things happened, but the recorder didn't work. So we'll just pretend that it worked. Dave, the Toronto Raptors won the 2019 NBA championship. We totally didn't have this conversation starting about 45 minutes ago. What do you think?
Honestly, Carlos, I'm ecstatic.
Still?
Yeah, a lot more tired than I was the first time I told you that, but I'm so happy. I'm so happy for Kyle Lowry and everything that he's represented for the team. And I'm excited because watching this playoff run has rekindled a love of basketball that I forgot I actually had. I remember as a kid playing NBA Jam, and that was my first into basketball.
You didn't get the NBA Jam story the first... What? Do you have any idea how much I love NBA Jam? You
It's
bastard.
so good.
You worthless...
Sorry, man.
Continue the NBA Jam. Keep going.
No, but I mean, I remember some of my best memories from my childhood are playing basketball with other people outside and playing NBA Jam inside. Now, I was never been a good basketball player. The only thing I was ever decent at was rebounding, and that was only when I was slightly above average height, and that only lasted for maybe a couple of months. So I suck at basketball. I can't play basketball very well, but that never stopped me from playing or enjoying it, except for the fact that I always freaking rolled my ankle pretty much every time I played. But anyway, the point is, I remember seeing games at Skydome with the Raptors when they first came in.
Yeah, in the early era.
And I'm excited about it. And there were times where I went to a lot of basketball games and didn't, and times where I was really into it and not. But I really feel that this whole playoff run has really rekindled a love of basketball that I've had. And, made me want to follow it more, want to listen to it more, want to get the takes from, the commentators and follow the draft and watch the draft. And, and obviously this free agency period, which is going to be really great. But honestly, it's just so great to see the country come together and everything like that. Last night my mom was involved stage managing a play, and I went to that because I knew it was going to be over basically before most of the game happened.
Hold on. I'm not letting the reference go because we got it the first time. Stage manager. Oaks! Just for you. Go on.
So, I come out of the theater. It's in downtown Burlington, about where Central Library is, if anybody knows where that is, in Burlington, Ontario. And I walk out, and I could hear the crowd at Spencer Smith Park. And I was like, okay. And I debated about going there, but my wife was still up, so I wanted to make sure that I spent some time with her and watched the game with her as much as I could. So I went home, and then I couldn't leave because I was just so ingrained into it, but also so stressed out that in order to calm down at one point in time, let's say halftime, I went and started putting IKEA furniture together for a brief period of time. What? IKEA furniture? That should stress you out more. Well, it kind of did, but at the same time, it took my mind away from the game enough that I could kind of take a moment and then come back to it, and there you have it.
And this is where I made a joke about Alan Keyes that was much funnier the first time. You just have to take my word for it. It was really good. It was beautifully timed. Please continue.
Yeah, so I'm pumped. I'm excited. I'm loving it. Kawhi is a legend no matter what he wants to do now. The other person I want to give kudos to, which I didn't the first time, but I'm going to now, I freaking love Serge Ibaka. I love the way that guy plays. I love the heart he has. And I honestly, just the way he played in this series for the limited amount of time he got, I told my brother, I had the text message, I said, I want some Raptors jerseys before you quit Sport Check while you still have the discount, and I want an Ibaka jersey.
Okay, so for everybody, for folks listening, the reason why we kind of had to repeat part of what we talked about the first time is because we had a little bit of a technical difficulty. The recorder seemed to be recording. We had a good conversation talking about a lot of the things that Dave just went through. And then I complained about the float about the NBA. I did a grumpy old man thing. And we're going to talk. I'm going to quickly highlight a couple of the points. But before I do, I want to make 2 quick points. Maybe I should just drag Dave into multiple hour podcasts because first of all, we did not get NBA Jam the first time, which hurts my soul personally. And secondly, not one mention of Serge Ibaka, which is now in the thing. Serge. Anyway, for this man, Got it for prosperity. Serge Ibaka's gotten his shout out. We also had a shout out for Max Kellerman, who correctly predicted the outcome of the finals. We had that. And I will make a quick point of a couple of trivia items for everybody. 15.9 million viewers watched it in the realm of Canada. 44% of the Canadian population. Very impressive. And then we'll briefly talk about the injury thing because it's still relevant, but I want to quickly gloss through it. Before I do, though, kudos and props to Kawhi Leonard for making 3 clutch free throws right at the end of the game. Because, to me, that was really changed the game because it was a 1-point game, just so we're clear. In the closing sequence, after Steph Curry missed, his shot attempt with about 8 seconds left, and Kawhi Leonard was trying to dribble the ball away, it ended up being captured by Golden State, and I think it was Draymond Green, who tried to call the timeout. Is that right, Dave?
Yes.
Yeah. So Draymond Green tried to call a timeout. They did not have any timeouts, which resulted in a technical foul. And then we talked about the nuances of NBA rules where the inbound pass resulted in no time going off the clock. So with 0.9 seconds on the clock, Kawhi Leonard was fouled, resulting in 2 shots, but no time came off the clock because the foul occurred prior to him getting the ball into his hands. So the clock actually didn't technically move. But it took an incredibly long time to decide that by staring at the replays. Which is one unfortunate thing about the closing sequence of the NBA because they have a talent for taking the last 30 seconds of a game and making them last 25 minutes if that's what they want to do. And that's maybe something they should work on. I have no idea how they would change that, but it's something they should probably look into.
So true.
So we already talked about Masai Ujiri, which you'll hear momentarily. Through the magic of editing, the conversation that happened before will now happen after. It's very magical.
So allegedly he got in an altercation with a police officer from Alameda County, right? That he tried to get on the court after they won because obviously he's an official and he's part of the team. He didn't have his credential, so he said, "You can't go on." He tried to shove him. The deputy, he stopped him again, said no. Then he shoved him harder and made contact with his face to the point where the police service there is pursuing charges against him. And then it also, a few years earlier, when he got on stage and he said, "Fuck Brooklyn," I don't know if you remember that or not.
Vaguely.
Before a series with Brooklyn, in which Brooklyn won. Obviously, Masai Ujiri is great at his job, right? And every time I've heard him speak, I've I have respect for the man. But there's this professionalism part that doesn't always compute, that doesn't always come through. I mean, yes, you're part of the team, but you can't be shoving police officers, right? So, the team hasn't commented on it yet. I know that the police service, the Alameda police have forwarded to the district attorney. So we'll see whether they actually go through with pressing charges and where that goes. That could make it interesting for next year because the rumor is out there that the Wizards want him and are willing to give him an ownership stake to get him.
That was the big rumor going around. Ownership stake potentially and a $10 million a year offer.
So we'll see what happens with that. Apparently obviously there hasn't been any contact between the Wizards and Masai yet. We'll see what happens. But I'm curious as to where him shoving the police officer story goes. Now, I know the law in Canada. I don't obviously know the law to the same extent in the United States. But in Canada, it's its own charge if you assault a police officer. Right? There's assault, and then which is a charge, obviously. And then assaulting a police officer is a separate charge. It's more significant. So I'm curious as to where that's going to go, what's going to happen with that, and if the team actually ever has anything to say on it. Because, I don't know, there's just these things that potentially put a tarnish on the whole thing in some way, shape, or form.
No, that's fair. I think, to be 100% honest with you, I think what's going to end up happening is that they're going to pursue it to a certain degree, but right now it would be kind of, unless the officer, because I think it was a deputy,
yes, it was a deputy.
Unless the deputy really wants to get into a whole media thing, unless the deputy is horrifically injured, if you've got an injury, then you may as well just sue the guy for damages. But as far as charges are concerned, it probably doesn't really warrant much effort. I will agree, from what I read about the story, I agree that they have the right to ask for credentials. Remember we talked about with Drake, the conversation about Drake? Not everybody and their brother should be able to get onto the court. Even after you win a championship, that doesn't give you a free pass to walk on the court. If I don't know who the hell you are, it doesn't matter if you're Masai Ujiri, the famous Masai Ujiri. If I don't know who the hell you are and you don't have any credentials, then to be honest, Masai could have accomplished the same task. I'm going to give Masai and the deputy the benefit of the doubt that the deputy may have been overzealous, But at the same time, Masai could have resolved this by saying, okay, hold on, and then waved to one of his players to ask them to come over because there's somebody to vouch for you. You don't have to, you can stand there and just wait and get one of the players or one of the members of your team, any members of your staff, anyone can come over, vouch for you, and then you got your free pass in.
Exactly.
So there is ways to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish without having to touch anybody. So it's something to bear in mind. It's a reality. So it'll be interesting to see. And as far as the offer from Washington comes in, I will say that even if Washington offers you an ownership stake in $10 million, which is a lot of money, I feel like you could just leverage this to get more money from Toronto, because I feel like unless Kawhi leaves and a bunch of other people leave, and you really think that you're going to have to blow it up and start over again, Washington is really no better situated to be any good next year necessarily.
True, but that ownership, if that ownership stake is really part of it, that's something that could seal the deal potentially.
It could be interesting,
right? Because that changes things.
I will say that an ownership stake in an NBA team is interesting because it's a good investment, because NBA teams have tended to inflate in value the way the NBA is running their business model. But I will say the Washington Wizards are probably going to suck no matter who runs them, because the Wizards have shown no capability to actually improve enough to be relevant. Aside from financially, I think it would be a fantastic deal. I just don't know if it would matter anywhere other than financially.
Fair enough.
But before we leave this topic, injuries. Obviously, I talked at length about the Kevin Durant injury, the long-term ramifications. Obviously, he's not going to be available next season, so that affects a lot of teams' plans potentially. Would the New York Knicks have gotten him? We don't know. But now it doesn't matter, because whether the New York Knicks get him or not, whether he agrees to the Golden State $31 million offer just to stay on their payroll while he rehabs or not, he's not going to be playing for anybody. So the balance of power is suddenly shifted in the West. And what that really does, and the point that I made originally, was that it changes what a Houston Rockets thinks. Because just when they thought their window had closed, now is it closed? I don't know. And then at the same time, Kawhi Leonard now in some ways holds the balance of power, because if he stays in Toronto, they're a favorite, I would say. If he goes to the LA Clippers, I would consider them to be a favorite, especially in the West, the way it's now composed, because between Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson tearing his ACL and potentially missing a good chunk of next season, the Golden State Warriors are now even more vulnerable than they were this season. Injuries got to them. And unfortunately for them, one point I didn't make the first time, so now I'm going to pull a Dave, and I'll add something that I didn't mention the first time. One thing that the Klay Thompson thing does, and the way the injuries compiled in this NBA Finals, is that the Golden State Warriors had gotten kind of lucky. In this dynastic run of 5 straight finals, they had avoided a lot of very high-profile injuries. They didn't have injuries to Kevin Durant the last 2 years. They didn't have major injuries to Klay Thompson the last couple of years. And Steph Curry had, for the most part, been able to play. So their core had been mostly intact during those NBA Finals. And they had been the beneficiary of some injuries on the other team. Especially Houston can tell you that last year, Houston might have been able to beat them if Chris Paul hadn't gotten hurt. So they've been on the receiving end of a lot of good injury luck. And this is one case where it just didn't work out for them. It's the exact opposite. All of a sudden, you got hit with all the injuries. Part of that also comes from playing an 82-game regular season and another 20 or so games in the playoffs, and doing that for 5 straight years. For some of your core players, that's 500 games.
It's a lot of basketball.
If you think about that in context, the likelihood of you injuring yourself goes up the more of those additional games. In a way, getting to Game 6 for Golden State actually turned out to be one of the worst things that could have happened to them, because in the end, they didn't win the title anyway, and Klay Thompson injured himself in a Game 6 that didn't result in anything good. Again, it's luck. It happens. It's part of the deal. I think that covers the main items. So as far as the NBA championship, is there anything else, any other thoughts you have on that?
No, I don't. I mean, we could get into like minutia details. I don't think that's really necessary. It's just the people that stepped up for the Raptors deserve the kudos, all the kudos, man. Like, Kawhi's going to get his praise, and absolutely he deserves it. But, we needed people like Fred VanVleet and Serge Ibaka, my man,
Gasol,
to step up. Gasol, and they did. They didn't always, but they did when they were needed to, right? Whenever the Raptors needed whatever they needed, they got. When they needed Kawhi, he was all world. When they needed somebody else, somebody else stepped up. It wasn't always the same person. Game 1 it was Pascal Siakam. He had a great game 6 as well. But games 2, 3, 4, 5 weren't as good. But somebody else was picking up the minutes, and I feel like the depth on this team and the all-around camaraderie and teamwork, it was just too much for a less than 100% healthy, obviously, Golden State team.
I think that's fair. But you know what? You bring up an interesting point. So I'm going to leave the NBA Finals topic as a whole, but I'm actually going to play off of it for a second because you brought up something that triggered something in my head. Here's a question for you. Based on the way that this NBA Finals went and the model of what the Toronto Raptors did and Masai Ujiri did, there's two things that come out of it that kind of strike me. Number one, he's rebuilt the idea of the high-profile player rental. Because if Kawhi Leonard does not stay, they still got the result that they would have wanted. The best possible case scenario for a 1 year quote unquote rental. If he sticks around, great. But if he does not, you couldn't have asked for a better outcome. Does that make other teams consider that kind of a gamble in the future with a similar caliber player as a Kawhi Leonard if they became available in similar circumstances? That's one. And number two, does this remake the model of how you build a championship team? Because if you look at the way the Golden State built its dynasty with the type of players they got a Kevin Durant, they had a Steph Curry, they had a Klay Thompson, they have a, Draymond Green. They had all these great players, and including a couple of top tier like, Steph Curry being a 2-time MVP, Kevin Durant being a 2-time Finals MVP, Klay Thompson having the capability of going off at any time and being absolutely explosive. The Toronto Raptors did it with one legitimate two-way superstar who is acknowledged as a top-tier player, and then a bunch of other players who are quite good, but not nearly on that level. It wasn't like the big three in Boston or what they did with Cleveland where they got, LeBron a second star, or what they did in the Miami Heat where you had
or what Golden State's done when Durant joined.
Correct. So it's a different model of building a championship team. In the world of sports where we like to be copycat, does that make a lot of teams rethink how they build their team? So do you need to have the super team then? Or is
No, I don't think you do, but I also think, and I've read a bunch of articles on this today, that the Raptors model isn't exactly an easy one to follow.
Any decent model isn't. That's
right.
The thing.
Based on a variety of factors and the way things played out in terms of trades that were either made, getting rid of Bargnani, or trades that weren't, in the fact that Lowry was on the chopping block multiple times and they didn't end up trading him. Or really, honestly, it's a ballsy move to trade DeRozan. Obviously there were other pieces. There were some picks. There was Jakob Poeltl. Danny Green was in the trade coming to Toronto.
You also got rid of the coach?
Well, yeah, the two main. But I'm talking about the trade. The two main pieces in the trade are Kawhi Leonard and DeMar DeRozan. Sure. And if it doesn't pan out, you've traded away a fan favorite, and what do you? But you know what? Luckily for Raptors fans and for Masai Ujiri, it couldn't have worked better, right? And they got rid of the coach, and Dwayne Casey is a great coach. I have a lot of respect for Dwayne Casey. I like Dwayne Casey, and he's done well this year in Detroit. But they got rid of him and replaced him with Nick Nurse. And some people say, well, do you really need to do that? But you know what? It's hard to criticize when the moves. It's easy to It's easy to criticize people when they don't work out, and it's hard to criticize people when they do.
That's fair. I think the main takeaway I have, though, is that kind of, to be honest with you, from an intrigue standpoint, because I think I made clear I like the storylines. The storylines make the NBA more interesting. I like some of the idea. I like the idea, and I'm hoping that some of the second-tier teams that aren't quite there at least consider the Raptor model of just reaching a certain point where, like, we know we can't go any further. Just go for it. Because at that point, Masai Ujiri was saying, I know we cannot get any further. They could have kept DeMar DeRozan and they would have been a good team. They would have gotten to the playoffs. They would have maybe won a round or two. And then it would have been a lot more of what you've already seen. But in this case, they went all out. And they got rid of a couple of players that people liked. They got rid of a coach that people respected. And they went with it. And in this case, it worked. But I think that teams should at least consider, if your team already has no hope anyway, because they plateau and they hit a certain level and that's it, what's the harm in going for it? Because if you're not in a position to win the championship anyway today, right now, The worst that happens is you digress. Well, then fine, rebuild it. But if you at least try, that's where you can, nothing ventured, nothing gained is the point that I'm trying to make. There's a lot of teams and a lot of general managers that are quite content to build a good team that will be consistent, that will get to the playoffs, that will maybe win a round or two, and then bow out, and then we'll repeat this process next year. And it never goes anywhere further. I kind of like the idea of somebody reaching a point where I know for a fact that if I do nothing, this team will be good, but I'm going to try. And if it doesn't work, it could be disastrous. But if it works, well, now you got a trophy.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't criticize that. You worked out, you did what you thought was best for the team, you took a chance. And, after so many years of almost being there or, having LeBron James turn Toronto into LeBronto, you also know that you have a window now because LeBron's gone. The East, as we've said multiple times on this program, the East was wide open, right? That's when you go for it. And, if it doesn't work out, well, you know what? You're probably going to be in some sort of rebuild mode anyway.
Yeah. We'll talk about this more later on. But the reality is, Toronto may very well have been a one and done. This might be it as far as this particular team is concerned. But the fans won't care because, and this is a point we've already made, Kawhi Leonard is a made man in Toronto. If he sticks around, I think it would be beneficial. I talked about the New Balance. The King of the North campaign is a pretty strong one, I think.
No, for sure. And don't forget that Joey Votto has offered him an unused Presto card.
The gifts, the tribute just keeps coming. It's absurd. And I'm sure Drake has endless shoulder rubs, as many as the man needs. Like, he's apparently good at that. That's his thing, I guess.
Oh, just don't get me started on Drake. Like, the respect level for Drake, like, I just got so sick of Drake this NBA playoffs. And last night was like the icing on the cake as to, like, what the hell are you talking? Did you hear Drake's postgame
No, I did. No, I okay. I watched the postgame a little bit, but I did not catch anything about Drake. Now you need
Carlos,
to tell me. Tell me the word.
So he starts going on about how poetic it is, the
Lord.
6th and 6.
Was it God's plan?
Right? And no, he didn't get to that. But then he started talking about, he's like, I like my chips. He's like, but I want my chips with dip. And people are like,
this is why this man is. I don't care. I refuse to acknowledge his quote unquote music career. He is the Degrassi kid. I refuse to acknowledge anything further.
And it's like what? I was like, just stop talking. Like, just stop talking. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not about you. Like, and then it was like, well, you saw some of the footage, right? So it's like, here's a shot of Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
And then Drake has his own little like private booth off to the side, and like, here's a shot of Drake jumping off the couch.
Yeah, did they
Who
expand?
the fuck cares about Drake jumping off the couch, Carlos? I don't care about Drake. I don't care about his little private area that he's popping champagn. I don't care.
Would you care if he was jumping off the couch with Tom Cruise? Because that worked with Oprah.
Yeah, but that's a you know what? That's a whole. If Oprah was there, sure, but without Oprah, jumping off the couch means nothing.
It doesn't work. Fair enough. Okay, I get you. Yeah, I noticed that actually. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, because the Jurassic Park isn't new. They didn't invent it this year. They've been doing
No, it's been around. It's been around for several years.
Yeah, they've been doing that for the postseasons for the Raptors the last couple of years. But that section that you're talking about with Drake, that's new, right? Like they built like
as far
a stage.
As to my knowledge, that is new.
Yeah, okay. Because I was like, what the hell is that? Do they got like a stage? Like, I'm guessing they play. I guess they play music over there, like before the game or something.
But it's like here. It's like if you want to, not only can you watch the game, you can watch Drake watch the game. For the love of God,
why
man.
were you not in Jurassic Park watching Drake watch the game?
Just like you know what I mean? Like I have a whole list of things that I would rather watch than watch Drake watch basketball. You know, like here's the thing. I have no issues with Drake's music career or his music.
I have some.
But I know you do. But the thing is, and I didn't mind when it was like Drake's going to be a global ambassador because it's kind of cool. He's a big name supporting the Raptors, whatever. You know, and for like a couple of games a year when they have Drake night, I'm sure. It's kind of cool.
Nights?
You know that?
Listen. Okay,
dude. I realize you don't follow basketball, but Carlos, man, you need to step up your game.
I genuinely don't want to. I enjoy living in ignorance of Drake night. Drake night, I feel, does not impact my capability of discussing what I watch on the court.
So anyway, yeah, Drake night's a thing. I have a T-shirt from the one I went to, not because it was Drake night, but because I was given free tickets and it happened to be Drake night.
How often is this Drake night? Is it once a season?
It's like 2, maybe 3 times a season.
Okay, and what happens on Drake night other than Drake?
All right. Well, not really anything. Sometimes they have like a special jersey or a special, like they'll wear, like they have the OVO jerseys. Drake's there, but which isn't really a big deal anymore.
Can we
they gave away free Drake T-shirts, Drake Night T-shirts.
I'm wondering, Dave. Just a question: do you think we could explore the possibility of doing like an off-season trade? Do you think we could trade celebrity superfans? Could we like trade Drake in a pick for like Jack Nicholson or something?
I would do that.
That'd be pretty sweet.
Done.
That'd be.
I don't even care who the pick. Freak, I'd trade Drake for Drake. I'd give like more to LA. You know what? Like you can have Drake and
Bieber. They can have Bieber.
Yes.
Done.
Yes.
Done. We'll give him Drake, Bieber, and a pick. Done. Just give us Jack, and we're good to go.
Done. I'm there. I'm signing up for that deal right now.
I feel like that's a thing that needs to be a thing, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
And at this point, given the dumpster fire that the Lakers are, I think Jack Nicholson would agree to this trade. He'd waive his no trade clause.
Yeah, probably.
He'd come down.
Heck, I'd take Spike Lee for a while.
Settle down. Settle down. I know it's late. I know you're sleep deprived. Dave, don't say anything you will regret forever. Settle down. I'm gonna need you to stop right there.
Just a question for you though. Would you take Spike Lee if he wasn't a New York Knicks fan?
The problem with Spike Lee is that I'm not going to get off on a long tangent about this, but the thing about Spike Lee that I don't understand, is he really a Knicks superfan though, or is he just a guy who has enough money to buy a lot of tickets to the Knicks because all he does is heckle other players and then motivate them to kill the Knicks? It's like he's not very good at this. It's not a Spike Lee curse. It's more like a direct impact. It's like, Spike Lee is annoying me. I am going to torch this team now.
No, fair enough. Also, speaking of curses, clearly there is no Drake curse on the Raptors. So how about Drake don't cheer for any other sport ever again? Just stick to basketball, just in a way that we don't have to notice you.
I'd be okay if he cheered for the Yankees.
Well, fair enough. I would be too.
Yeah. We can always arrange that as part of the deal. No, that's good. I think as far as the NBA championship, we are good. Again, congratulations, Toronto Raptors. Congratulations to the longtime Toronto Raptors fans. I refuse to call you long-suffering because I already talked about the St. Louis Blues, and if you listen to my story about the St. Louis Blues, I would argue the St. Louis Blues fans are much more long-suffering. However, with that said, congratulations just the same. Well done. One other point I'll make, because unfortunately it was missed on the cutting room floor when the technology failed me the first time. One thing we did touch on was the impact, the potential impact of this Raptors NBA championship on the youth, the potential future generations of basketball fans that were generated by people watching this, this playoff run. And one point that I made was that there is a documentary on Netflix called The Carter Effect that you can check out that was produced by LeBron James and Maverick Carter, that tandem. And it's actually quite well done. I got a chance to watch it. It's quite good. And it's a good indicator for you, if you're not familiar, with the impact that Vince Carter was able to make in his brief time in Toronto, just by being a very popular player and giving the franchise some hope. Because in the earliest days of the franchise, it was Damon Stoudemire, who was a good player, but he was never a real, star player. Vince Carter was the first, star player into borderline superstar player who's still playing. And he might break the record for most seasons played if he manages to suit up for a team next season. So it's kind of cool that his career has lasted this long. But he was the first guy to put Toronto on the map for basketball, really. And the impact has been felt to this day with a lot of Canadian NBA players. So it is something worth noting. It is kind of an important thing that happened. And this could be a catalyst for something similar for the next generation of basketball talent.
Absolutely. And let's hope it is. But I'm pretty sure it will be.
For sure. Sounds good. So I think as far as that's concerned, I think we're good with that. Right. I'll leave it to you. Do you want to talk about what we're looking forward to?
Yes, let's go with what we're looking forward to. And I'll go through. Well, first of all, I'm looking forward to not having to watch basketball for a while because I'm not sure my heart could take much more basketball. So I said the best thing about Game 6 was that there isn't going to be a Game 7 because I'm not sure I'd be able to handle that. So I can focus in for at least the next little bit on other things, other sports. So really the only thing I'm just gonna keep it to one thing, and that is actually really starting to pay attention to the Women's World Cup. So yes, that is pretentious cross-country running taking place in France right now. And Canada won their first game against Cameroon 1-0. And tomorrow, which is Saturday, they're playing New Zealand in the second game, which they should beat, but we'll see what happens. But, to really take a stranglehold on their group if they do. So I'm looking forward to that. And then obviously the continuation of that throughout the week and into the early part of July.
So since you bring it up, since you were talking about the Women's World Cup, I wasn't going to give the pretentious cross country running intro. But question: do you actually have any thoughts on the U.S. celebrations against Thailand?
I do. So here's the thing. Honestly, I mean, I've obviously heard a lot of stuff about it, different takes or whatever. So I think this is a fair take. Number one, you know what? If the team is going to play poorly enough that you can score 13 goals on them, put in 13 goals. Because as we've mentioned multiple times, nobody just wants to see you just pass the ball back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So if you can get 13 goals, that's great. And now people so here, several points. Now you're going to get me on a bit of a tangent. But first of all, Alex Morgan, who scored 5 goals in that game and was celebrating like she'd never scored before. Well, one of her things is like, well, some people have never scored in the World Cup before and they dream of this. Fair enough. You have. And you scored 5 goals in that game. Okay? Tone it the fuck down. Okay? Second of all, people saying, well, would you complain about the men's team? You're damn right you would, right? And this is the best tweet I saw on this, okay? If France ended up playing like, let's say, some random CONCACAF team, because let's get into the hatred of CONCACAF again. So let's pick some random thing. Let's say, I don't know, Martinique. Although I think their players play for France. Let's say St. Vincent's and the Grenadines. Let's say somehow St. Vincent and the Grenadines gets into the World Cup and they're playing France and they're just getting destroyed and Paul Pogba starts doing some Paul Pogba-esque thing on the 13th goal and some crazy celebration. Are you telling me they're going to be like, oh, well, it's the men, so go ahead? No, you're going to be telling me he's a pretentious asshole because he is at that point. You don't do that. So here's the thing. Granted, I know where soccer is, but if I'm the American women now, right? If I'm in a game that isn't in doubt, I bet you they're going to get fouled a little harder than they would before.
I think that would be a fair response, though, for me. I will say I don't have a stake in this, but since you brought it up, I thought it would be interesting to ask. But I will say there is precedence for this already. So it's one of those things where, like Alex Morgan, you don't have to look very hard. Let me give you a simple example. I've talked in the past about the state of women's hockey. It's better now internationally than it's ever been. But for a long time, it was just Canada and the U.S. were the only legitimate teams in women's hockey. So if you looked at the Olympics or the World Championship, there were basically 2 teams who had a real chance to win, and that was it. And they got to play a lot of teams that are traditional hockey powers who were just not developed. So they would play like a Russia or they would play like a Finland or a Sweden or whatever, who in men's hockey were good. They were at that top tier. But the Canadian and American women's teams for a long time, they could destroy them 10-0. They could destroy them 15-0. They could destroy them 20-0. I didn't watch a lot of those games, to be honest, because you knew the other team was going to get massacred. I would hope that they wouldn't go off on gigantic celebrations, given that they were expected to destroy that other team. It wasn't going to be competitive. Everybody knew it. And
now I would say women's soccer at this point is at a more competitive place than women's hockey was when we're talking about that stage.
Sure, but Thailand is on that level where they are one of those teams who, while they can qualify, will get destroyed by a superior team of that caliber.
Right, but you don't have as many of those teams as but still, yeah, you know what I mean? I think that's a fair and valid comparison. But yeah, no, I have an issue with it. Now, I have a feeling that generally some people who have issues with it have a bigger issue with it because it's the American team and people love to hate America, especially at sport, because usually the Americans are pretty good at it. So I think that enters to it as well. But there's no need, right? If it's your first World Cup and you've never scored before, that's fine. I get that and I understand that. And I think that's a different story. but that's not what was happening, right? You had people who scored the first World Cup goal, but you had lots of people who have been in a World Cup, who have been at this before, who have won the World Cup, who are still acting like, I think, very immaturely and very inappropriately. That's my personal opinion. So we'll see what happens, right? But, a win is a win. They've got their 13 goals, right? Hey, whatever. It is what it is at this point. But in the long term, I hope we don't see that again if it happens.
That's fair. So you're looking forward to the Women's World Cup. Anything else going on?
No, I'm going to keep it to one because I think that's all my brain can handle at this point in time.
Fair. Not even the CFL. Did you catch any of the highlights from your Ticats game?
I did. Yeah. So, obviously, I'm hoping that on next week's podcast, we actually will get into the CFL a lot more. But obviously, we need to devote the time that we did to the Raptors because, it's important and it's a huge story.
They actually won a
But yeah. But I mean, the Ticats won. So their home opener. So that's great. And although there was a big hit on the quarterback, and there's a new thing we'll talk about, I think we'll just leave it to next week. Right now, I'm just going to say I'm happy they won, and let's move on.
Yep, that's fine. Just make a note
Oski
of it.
wee wee.
Yeah, just make a note of it because I think I believe in the early part where I recorded it, I think I made reference. We're definitely going to probably get it in some CFL because, our good old Canadian content. Plus, it's football in the summer, so that's what we got. Hockey's over, basketball's over, outside of the off-season shenanigans. And now it's going to be a bit of a dry spell because the Jays...
Yeah.
Anyway, so the only thing that I'm looking forward to and one thing that I'm looking less forward to. So I'm looking forward to watching the U.S. Open. Want to catch the tail end of that at Pebble Beach, so that should be good. A lot of good golfers in contention. And then I spent about 2 minutes trying to figure out what else I was looking forward to. We don't have hockey. We don't have basketball. Baseball is questionable. I'll watch some games. That means that I am reduced to the Week 1 CFL. 2 games on Saturday. Woo. Week 1 CFL, you guys. We did it.
CFL.
We did it. And then Dave's brain melted down, and I'll leave it out for his benefit. But I just want you to know that it happened. It was beautiful. Steam came out. It was great. It was spectacular. But I think that's it for us. That is what we're looking forward to. We will come back next week. We will probably talk a little bit about the CFL. We're not going to do a season preview because the season has literally already started. But that doesn't mean we can't talk about what we think may occur, and then see what may come from a CFL season and our mandatory CRTC Canadian content. Very important. With that said, from myself and Dave, that is episode... Oh, one last thing before I go. I did mention it in the opening intro, but I'm including you in this part, Dave. You realize this is episode 20 of the Unnecessary Nonsense Podcast. 20. We did it.
Woohoo!
We made it. That's about 19 and a half more than I thought we'd get to. It's a beautiful moment. Well done. Good job by you. Yes. All right. Last shameless plug before I cut it off. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube at Unnecessary Nonsense Podcast. Just type it in. You can check out archived versions of the podcast. All of these go up in addition to the podcast items. They goes up on the YouTube channel. You can see a lovely static image of our faces in cartoon form. That's always good. And if something major happens, I didn't do one for the NBA championship because I had already done one for one of the early pieces. However, if another major news item comes into play, if Kevin Durant, takes over, fights space aliens or something cool, then I will make a video on that subject and it'll end up on the YouTube channel. Outside of that, we will catch you on the next episode of the Unnecessary Nonsense Podcast.